Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of the Lincolnshire Research School Evidence Briefing series. And this evening our focus is on SEN. My name's Alan Eathorne. I'm an exec head in Learn Academies Trust. And this evening I'm joined by Karen Robinson, who is the Deputy Director of Lincoln Research School, and Lucy Wallace, who is our expert Senko for the evening, who works at 4 schools in Learn Academies Trust and is going to add her valuable experience and perspective to the work that we're looking at tonight. So just a quick reminder about the work that we do within the research school network. So some of the work that we do is about synthesizing the data and information and the evidence that's out there and making that accessible for schools and leaders to use. Sometimes we generate that evidence, so we might be part of trials to see what things seem to work and don't work. And then one of our big roles is about mobilizing that information, and that's what this video is here today, is to help share information from the guidance report and helping you to make sense of it. And just a reminder that we know with all of these things that being evidence informed is about capturing evidence, looking at evidence, reviewing evidence, and also alongside our professional expertise as well, and helping us to make those best bets. And that's what we're here to do and to help with. And just to help us from an engagement point of view, if you haven't already signed up to this link and you've seen it via another way, then if you could use the QR code to register that you've watched the video, that'd be really helpful for us. So just a couple of quick points linked to SEN. So why is SEN important? Well, partly because it's the law, as you could see there. It's all pupils have a right to effective teaching and full participation in the community of a school, as set out in those different pieces of legislation. And also, we know that in the Code of Practice from 2015 about the quality of teaching of pupils with SEN and the progress and all the work that we need to do to make sure that teachers are well equipped to do this and to help make sure that progress happens as well. So the main kind of message there at the bottom is about, well, if every leader is a leader of SEND, then so every teacher is a teacher of SEN as well. Within the guidance report, it's as always a great document full of lots of useful resources and can feed into all sorts of work that you do as a leader in school and to help develop your staff. One of the quite nice, useful starting points is this page where it goes into more detail about some misconceptions, so 4 common misconceptions in SEND. And that's just a really good place to start and to kind of remind everybody about, what we do and why we do those things. And Lucy, you were going to help share a little bit about this slide or this page.
Yes, this next slide really links with all of the work that Asenko would be doing. So it talks about how a pupil's development's not linear. They'll go through lots of patterns of development over time within schools. So part of my role as Senko would be working with the teachers and the teaching assistants to track how a pupil is attaining and developing over time. That could be social emotional development, peer skills, as well as the academic side of things and their emotional well-being. We would also do things like looking at the environment. So obviously, if you've got a class where there's been lots of change, maybe a staff member is off, we have to be mindful that these things could all feed into things that are happening for the child as well as their wider environment as well. So if you've got things like a family bereavement or maybe a parental breakdown, even things like new siblings joining the family, all of these things build into that overall picture of the child. So it really is about thinking about the whole child, not just a small snapshot in time when we're thinking about whether there are underlying additional needs for a child.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Yeah, that I think that diagram is quite helpful to sort of.
Mm.
It's a simple diagram, and as we know, quite a complex process. But it's a good way of sharing with staff and a reminder about how that all kind of fits together. Great, thank you. So on to the guidance report. So we always suggest it's a good idea to either download or have a copy of this document to sit alongside watching this video, and obviously to share that with staff should you use this video as part of a staff meeting or as a SLT meeting or those things. So just a reminder, that's where all this information comes from. So we're going to be looking through the 5 recommendations in some detail today. There's lots within each of them. Quite often they lead to other guidance documentation as well. So we'll kind of go quite quickly, I guess, through the 5 different areas, and then sort of offer chances to think about what to kind of go more deeply into, to go from there. So to give you an overview. And so I should pass over to Karen, who's going to lead us through recommendation number 1.
Thank you, Alan. So what we're looking at is recommendation 1, and we're thinking about how to create that positive and supportive environment for all pupils without exception. And it's how to remove those barriers of learning and participation so that all the needs of the pupil are met, and how to create those positive relationships, the well-being of all the pupils. So having a little bit of a look at that now. One of the first things that's really important is the language we're using. And we're thinking about pupils with SEND rather than our SEND pupils. And that understanding that pupils don't always have SEND for their whole school lifetime. Things are changing all the time. And it's really important, the language we're using around our pupils with SEND, and making sure that that language is really positive, and understanding that any behaviour that is shown is a form of communication, and how we're going to really understand that communication and what our pupils with SEND are trying to tell us and why they're behaving in a certain way. We've included lots of documents. There's one here just so you can look at a little bit later. But the next slide that Lucy said is really nice to think about this language. And I'll just pass over to her.
This, I believe, is from the Beacon Trust, who do lots of work around attachment, but I thought it really is very fitting. I had a new head teacher came into my last school, and I actually felt that we did this really, really well. But actually, quite early on, I started to realise, oh, while we thought we were using this person-centred language, we were having situations where staff members would say, oh, this child's having a meltdown, can we have support? So meltdown is one of those initial, it seems quite gentle and friendly, but actually it is suggesting that the child is struggling, but maybe not in such a delicate way. So we started to use the terms the child was in crisis, because it's not something they're choosing. Meltdown and tantrum can be a little bit blurred. So we switched that to use the term crisis. There's lots of other examples on there. So attention seeking was kind of the buzzword maybe 6-10 years ago. But what we're realistically saying is that's attachment seeking. They're seeking that adult time and relationship. Sometimes they might describe a child as being withdrawn, but actually that's perhaps a sign that they're moving into survival mode and moving away to protect themselves. Again, if a child is being rude or back chatty, sometimes that is defence and panic. The phrase "they're not engaging," it almost makes it sound like they're choosing. It possibly means they don't trust you yet. They've not built up that safe relationship. So lots and lots of these terms really are about us thinking about the way that we describe a child, to describe their behaviour rather than them physically choosing some of the others, unacceptable behaviour. okay, by a school policy it may be deemed unacceptable, but if we're talking about that with the child, it's, if we look at the back picture, is that behaviour understandable? If they're dismissive, again, that might link to the child being in fight, and survival mode. They're not in the right place for learning. So it's about us coming down onto their level and giving them strategies and time to support them to feel ready. We've got aggressive and defiant there again. And if you're thinking of it with perhaps a parent's head on, if you saw any of these statements on a behaviour log or in a behaviour book that comes home, some of those are actually a little bit harsh and in your face. So it is thinking about a way to accurately describe what's happened, without sort of pointing fingers or speaking negatively to the child. It is actually describe the action or the behaviour that you're seeing, without putting a statement on it that says it's chosen or has been deliberate. And it was a real eye-opener, this one, just starting to think about reflecting on the language we use about our young people, because in the same way we wouldn't like it if they said we were shouting all the time or snapping. Again, that may be their interpretation of how somebody's responding, but it might not be the same as the next person's reflection. So yeah, it's just being really open to how we describe the children.
Thank you, Lisa. That was really useful. And I think a really good point to stop and pause and think about the language used in your own school. Again, this is really nice, just thinking about strategies, how we can support our pupils with their emotional well-being in the classroom. Actually, I was going to let you talk about this one as well, Lucy. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. I know when we were first pulling the slides together, the connect before correct, I found a lovely little poster with it on. Again, when I did my staff inset at the start of the year, that was the first thing that I said. So all too often, if we see a child struggling, we're straight in asking questions or making demands and putting expectations on the child, but actually connect with them. You know, if there's a child under a table, they're clearly under there for a reason. Sit with them and ask, how can I help? Are you okay? And just have that little bit of connection and give them your time. 9 out of 10, you would find they would respond and come out of the table in a more desirable outcome than you sort of physically trying to move them out of the table or threatening the loss of a playtime, which actually is a damaging impact on your relationship with the child then. Some other lovely tools, the emotion coaching I've used across the schools that I've worked in, and there's a really lovely script which I'm not sure as we've put it at the end, but there's several online if you put a search in, and it's about reflecting on what you see and being mindful. So you might say, I can see you're finding it really tricky at the moment. I wonder if it might help if we take 5 minutes to go outside and spot 5 things linked with our senses, and then we can talk about what's upset you. And hopefully you'd be able to bring the child back round to the classroom once they'd had a little bit of time. And again, that's building those relationships so they understand that you care about them, you're invested, and not just thinking about that, gosh, we've got to get that maths lesson taught, which ultimately is the goal. But if you push it, you may find the whole lesson's disrupted, whereas this has built the relationship with the child. Alongside that, sensory tools are great. We are moving away from the term fidget was used for a long while. I think that was kind of in the public domain, fidget tools, but we're using the term sensory tools, and we've got some great posters now that set some rules and expectations out around them, because we'd got staff that were confiscating them, but actually they're there to be used to support learning and to keep the child focused. But if you don't teach them that, they don't know it is just a toy, they are going to become engrossed. So it's teaching them what you expect them to do with the tool, and if they don't follow the expectations, it may be that you will sit it still for them. So you've got the hands-on fidget tools. Some of our children like doodle books or using the mindfulness colouring, things like wobble cushions to help those that need that little bit of sensory regulation. And there's lots out there in the mainstream now. They've become quite a thing that families are using at home as well. So then we've got things like move there, so giving children opportunities to move around the classroom and use different seating in the room, and things like giving them space. So typically, you know which child, if you go in and observe a class, you know which child is probably going to have SEMH or behavioural needs because you hear their name a million times. And it's actually finding different ways to do that. So sometimes it might be a gentle hand on the table in front of them as you continue teaching, but it just reminds them, I'm here and you need to stop whatever it is you're doing. Sometimes it's a look. I've had children before that I've had a signal, so they've known that's the 3rd time I've clocked it. It depends, but again, they're little things that you can build as part of the relationship with the child. Private talk I've always found is much, much better. So if a child's being particularly disruptive, I might pop my hand on the desk, continue teaching, set a paired activity off, and then just come down onto the child's level so that you're talking on a one-on-one and just sort of explain, I've noticed that you've been a little bit chatty today and you're interrupting the lesson. Has something happened? And it's that questioning and giving the children an opportunity to think about why they're behaving in that way. And then obviously explaining, perhaps I've got the lesson to teach now, but maybe 5 minutes before break we can have some time and talk through that a little bit more. Definitely options. We found lots and lots of our children that are perhaps on the autism spectrum or waiting for assessments, potentially showing some PDA type traits where anything we say isn't right. So very much giving them the option. So it might be, you can either do that sitting here, or would you like to just pop into the blue room, which is a breakout space we've got in one of our schools. And we get much more success with the child picking where they're going to do the activity than us digging our heels in and saying, you will do that sat here, as I say. So it's just giving them that little bit of flexibility. High praise is a really interesting one. It's a bit of a dual edge. Some children absolutely love and thrive on praise. Lots of staff chuckle at me because I've actually got stickers on my lanyard that I can give out to the children, and even year sixes absolutely love having them. But there are other children that shy away from it, and there's a couple in particular that I know can't stand stickers and public praise. So it just has to be kind of a sentence. You've done a good job with that piece of writing, and then we carry on. Because if you make a fuss, they get embarrassed and more emotional. And time out is a great strategy. Again, it's that I quite often do it as an option. So do you feel you can stay in and carry on, or would it be useful to take the 3-minute timer and sit in the book corner and come back to me once you've had a pause, just to give the children a little bit of time to reset and then come back to learning once they're feeling more regulated.
Thank you. That was really useful. And it all comes down to really knowing your child, doesn't it, and the pupils that you're working with. And just this is a similar thing, just knowing, think about all the time your children with SEND, making sure they're sat in the place where they can sort of have hearing clear instructions, they're not going to be distracted, check they've got good views of everything, that everything's adequate. If they need to be and some children need to be in a cooler place, they need to be able to leave the room. Knowing your child, just think about, are they confident to speak out? Or is it good to have a partner? Do they prefer to write something down, and all of these things? And so in the guidance report, you'll see lots of examples of how to support the children in your classroom. And this links very much with the behaviour as well recommendation, and also the social emotional recommendation I should have alongside this. Both ones are really important. And it just keeps repeating this understanding of your pupils and their influences, teaching learning behaviours alongside managing this behaviour, and have different things in place. So regular routines and consistency, really. Just to end this, because you might want to pause now, there is something you could discuss now and think through, if that would be useful. Is there anything else, Alan or Lisa, you would like to add linked to recommendation 1?
The only advocate I would probably add is that in terms of seating plans, I've had a few children lately that our staff in some of the schools will regularly move seating plans to reflect on things that are working well and things that aren't working well. But obviously for a lot of our neurodivergent children, just bear in mind that they might need to know when they go home that evening where they're sitting. So we've got a few children that we keep in the same space, but other children move. But it's that pre-warning so that they know it's coming. We've had a couple of children, otherwise they really struggle with anxiety and the panic of it's all going to be different. Where will I be? How will it work? So sometimes it's that taking a step back and thinking that strategy is definitely needed, but how can I make it supportive for this child?
Yes, thank you. And those clear routines, isn't those visual timetable, all those things in place so those children know what's going to happen next. Okay, Alan, I think this is for you now.
Thanks both. Yes. So moving on to recommendation 2, and it feeds, as they all do, into each other. So so recommendation 2 suggests that we build an ongoing holistic understanding of your pupils and their needs, which I guess kind of sounds fairly obvious, doesn't it, sometimes? But as always, it's sort of in the details, as it were. So I'm sure you'll all have been aware in the past of the process of assess, plan, do, review approach, which is, which effectively is great formative assessment, isn't it? It's that kind of understanding where the child or children are, what we're going to do about it, do it, and see if it works, and see where we've got to. So in terms of from an SEN perspective, then it's considering, that what is it that we're assessing? Blunt instruments on such as kind of standardized tests or statutory tests might not be very helpful in that. So it might be, like with all children, sort of breaking it down, and being quite specific about how we use that. We talk about in that recommendation about the assessment should be regular and purposeful rather than a one-off event. And that's really helpful because you can start to see that kind of build up and that movement, and to capture those different areas. And then kind of helping teachers to feel empowered and trusted about kind of what comes next. And that's obviously part of that work that we do as a whole team in schools. So without going into all the details here, I guess from my kind of perspective, and I don't know, Lucy, if you want to come in on this, that considering those different areas. So, for example, we're quite in schools used to collecting data on test results and SATs results, things like that. But often, then that's quite blunt, isn't it? And it's not very useful sometimes. So if we were looking at the four areas, is that something that you would do then to get that kind of holistic picture?
Definitely, that's part of our initial concerns process within school. So if you have got an initial worry about the child, the teacher would give a few ideas as to what those concerns might be, but then we've got some statements that go against each of these areas of additional need to then try and break down, because on sometimes particularly communication interaction, on first glance you think, oh, there's not any concerns, but quite often when you track back they relate to speak, or the child had speech and language input when they were younger. And I know from a lot of training that I've done with the NHS speech team that just because they're no longer under NHS speech therapy doesn't mean they don't still have a speech and language difficulty. Sometimes that's to do with the length of processing time. They may need additional thinking time and clearer instructions, maybe visuals. So actually, again, it is about that wider picture of the child. What else is going on for them in their learning?
Great, thank you. And I think it's that in order to get a really good picture, it's kind of thinking a bit more differently, and that's where, like you say, sort of thinking about those specific areas of need, and trying to capture that. And one of the things I always, we'll talk about later on as well with recommendations, it's if we're not capturing that information, then we don't really know whether we've made an impact or not as well. So that's the other bit that's that's helpful, that in terms of that review, it's a chance then to see what is working or what's not working, and then follow that cycle again. So in terms of then consider, there's some good questions there really to think about, kind of to help us with this process. There's more in the guidance report on this particular area, and as we've already mentioned, that point about the pupil's development is driven by the everyday activities and the interactions. So thinking about those bits, thinking about how we capture those, thinking about these things help us to kind of give that overall picture and to develop that overall picture, to spot where there are particular strengths, interests, aspirations, those kind of things, and ultimately what can we do, what could be improved, and to help in that situation. And then I'll let you pause the video, so either in the document or here you can read of a couple of case study examples of going through this process. So we'll just pause the video if you want to read them more. And that leads us on to recommendation 3, and I'll pass you back to Karen.
Okay, so that key to recommendation 3 is just really all pupils have access to high quality teaching. And we'll talk about through all of those strategies. And the main ones we talk about with our children with SEND are the ones that are listed below. We're going to go into a little bit more detail as we say. But the problem is that naturally outcomes for students with SEND are poor. So we really do need to be thinking about their best chances, besides everything else that's happening with them, and how they're going to have their best chances of learning and to remember. And so coming on to our next slide, you're probably familiar with the SEND 5 a day, and that real focus on explicit instruction, cognitive metacognitive strategies. And here I, of course, would signpost you to the metacognition and self-regulation and guidance report, that scaffolding, flexible grouping and use of technology. Now, the next slide goes into a little bit more detail of what exactly we mean by that. So that explicit instruction, that really clear, focused teaching, and that modelling that's happening at the very start before that independence, and also making sure that that cognitive load isn't too much, it's not overwhelming, even with the thought of how you're presenting your PowerPoints and how you're jumping around. So a very focused, explicit teaching, thinking about, as we just said, those cognitive strategies and how you're going to get that information transferred into the long-term memory, and what you're going to put in place to help that memorization point as well, and that revisiting and all those retrieval things that we talk about. Scaffolding can take in all different forms. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more, making sure that's in place. That might look differently for different children. Flexible grouping, just moving those children around to what they need at that moment, and just being very sort of reflective and adapting to what they need. And also some students just prefer that use of technology and how that best supports them. If children are struggling with their handwriting, for example, they might prefer to type. Also just being aware of how those students learn. I won't read this through, but when you have a look at the slides, you'll have a chance just to look at a different explanation of these 5 a day. I've just added this tool because it's quite good to reflect on what you're doing as well, and maybe which areas you might want to work on a little bit more in that, and what's happening in your schools. So going back to the metacognition self-regulated guidance report, this 7-step model is something we talk about all the time, and I just think that's a key to high quality teaching in all classrooms. And that is thinking about how you're activating that prior knowledge in the first place. Are you using sort of mini whiteboards? What diagnostics, what vocabulary are you looking at? Then there is that explicit strategy, and actually a key is making sure that vocabulary and that understanding of key terms are explained. And sometimes knowledge organisers can be really useful for this, and also useful scaffold. Lots of modelling to see that, but also something that sometimes gets missed out is that memorisation strategy, because once it's memorised, that reduces that cognitive load. And how does that look? And then we move on to that guided practice. So we're moving towards independence, so the teacher's doing less. It will be happen at different points for different children, but what we're hoping is that independent practice, and also then that makes that confidence for the children to have a go independently, and then reflecting on what they've done. So one thing, the 7-step model is really, really useful. I don't know if Lucy or Alan, you want to add anything about this?
I mentioned earlier, I've seen some really great examples of this recently that have actually flipped my mindset a little. I'm always very mindful that I don't want to put a cap on the learning of the children that we have in school with SEND, but I was in some classes recently. It was the same year group, and one class were teaching all about different parts of modal verbs and how to use those within sentences. And that real explicit, the teacher explained, they watched a video, there were some little activities that they did in partners and checked with the video, the teacher recapped again, and then they worked in pairs, and then the children worked independently on an activity. And one of the children with an EHCP absolutely wowed me because they'd completely grasped the concept. And the sentence was something like, he can play football, blank, play in goal. He blank play in goal. And the other child wanted to put couldn't play in goal, but my child that had some additional needs was able to explain, but it says that they can play football, so it's got to be a modal verb that shows that they could have played in goal as well. And there was some amazing debate around that, and from what I knew of that child that was functioning 2 to 3 years behind their year group in general, actually really accessed that lesson, and it was meaningful to them. So I saw it working in principle, which was brilliant.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, it's just that really clear, explicit instruction.
Definitely.
So just talking a little bit more about scaffolding, that can take many forms, but this is just a nice example. And then there's sentence stems, there's writing frames, even knowledge organisers we mentioned. So many different things. It can be more than just thinking idea of a worksheet. Just so think of all the different ways you scaffold, and that will look different in different subjects as well. The frame model is really useful, particularly for our children with SEND, is that understanding what a non-example is and spending time really talking about that. Also, I was thinking about modelling, lots of things, thinking about dual coding as well. So often pictures really help alongside an explanation if you're giving cards, or again on these knowledge organisers, but also that idea of embodied cognition. So sometimes just acting things out. So just thinking about when you're explaining those definitions, those examples and those non-examples, how they really look. And just, there's many types of graphic organisers, and here's a few, and they link sometimes to those different subjects. Just before we go into the next one, is there anything Lucy or Anna you'd like to add there?
I think I was just going to say, I think my reflection of years in teaching and as an NQT many moons ago, that sometimes it's just quite overwhelming about knowing quite what to do or where to begin, or like that there isn't one single thing that just suddenly be the, I don't know, the word is the sort of the magic bullet or the magic, the bit of magic or something that's going to suddenly do. And I think that's what I think could be tricky. And as leaders, that's what we're there to help, to kind of make it all a bit clearer, probably, rather than there's so much out there, isn't there? I think is what I'm trying to get
I
at.
think you're right.
It's hard to get there. So, Karen, do you want me to carry on with recommendation 4?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that, or one of the areas in schools that quite often, I think, kind of can be overwhelming, excuse me, is about our use of interventions. So whether it's small group or one-to-one interventions, and we know, they can be a powerful tool, but must be used carefully. And I think that's the kind of key bit, that sometimes the temptation is, well, if we bombard a child with as many interventions as possible, then that will solve everything. And we know that it's just too much, and it doesn't work. So trying to get that balance right between what is part of high quality first teaching and what could be done during an intervention, and trying to see the difference between an intervention and interventions in schools, and just trying to kind of make sure that we don't go kind of too far with that. So this recommendation helps us to kind of just to consider that, really, and to be part of that, as we spoke earlier, that process of kind of assessment and assessing, to know in our plan what are we going to do and where should we go to with it. So, as you can see there, the area of research showing the strongest evidence for TAs having a positive impact on pupil attainment focuses on their role in delivering structured interventions in one-to-one small group settings. So we know that they do have an impact, but like with everything, and the kind of banana-rama effect of, it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. And that's really clear, I always think, with interventions, particularly when it could be sort of the case where a child starts an intervention and they're on it for years and years and years and years without really kind of capturing whether it's having an impact, whether to continue or to stop, and kind of those sorts of things. So to help with this, I found this brilliant a few years ago when I discovered this, that to help kind of think through the process of intervention, or an intervention, the target kind of guide there. So firstly, thinking about timing, obviously, and thinking about how it fits in, how long's a session, how many times a week is it possible to do. Have we considered the assessment? So do we know where the children are starting, and are we capturing some sort of an assessment to know where they've got to? Are the resources in place? So, as we've probably all been there, where an intervention happens, but we haven't actually got the resource to be able to carry it out. Sometimes we don't give it enough time. Sometimes we give it too much time, but sometimes we don't give it enough time to see whether it's made a difference over a sustained period of time. My complete bugbear with professional development is often we ask teaching assistants who have had no training in delivering this intervention to pick it up and do this intervention. So, thinking about that, and also not seeing interventions as separate things. How does that link to what the teacher's doing, and the teacher being linked to it and knowing what's happening and all of those kind of things? So I think it's a really good thing, particularly for Senkos and leaders in schools, to just help think through an intervention. Have we really consider those different areas before we kind of commit to doing an intervention or starting an intervention? And so that's just a sort of slightly larger and a summary of the kind of most effective interventions. This is what they appear to do. And well, the quote there helps us to sort of think that the key is to view the intervention from the pupil's point of view. So when they return to the lessons, teachers can ask questions that help them apply, demonstrate, and consolidate the new learning. So it's that thing of being linked to what's happening in the classroom, and the teacher and the TA working as a team, rather than it being a child whisked off to have some intervention that no one really knows what's going on and what's being learned. And within the tools on the EEF website, linked to this guidance report, there's some useful documents to help with that planning and to think through that process. So just before I move on to the final recommendation, Lucy, your experience of interventions, how's that been?
Yeah, I would say quite mixed. I think, like you say, there does sometimes tend to be a habit that you get to year 4, year 5, and children have been on phonics intervention progressively throughout school, and it's about making sure that they're measurable sequences of time, and that you're being really proactive as a teacher in knowing what's being covered in those sessions, so that you can then see if there is an impact on their learning. Some phonics research says keep going, some says try different approaches, but I would say that if a child has had multiple interventions in that area of support, by sort of year 4, year 5, you probably are starting to think, actually, what would they benefit more from? I would say it's that whole word reading and sight reading. So we'd start looking at interventions more focused around high frequency vocabulary, words that they are going to be using regularly. And again, whether that's something more specific like precision teaching, which is really focused and something that you can very clearly track, you'd then be able to see if any progress is evident, or again, if you need to go back to the drawing board and find something else that would benefit that child.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think it's one of those things. Forcing is probably the wrong word, but forcing people to stop and reflect on, is this making any difference? And that comes back to those first couple of points about building that holistic picture and that kind of understanding and doing the assess bit. And if we haven't put those things into place, we're never going to know whether this is making a difference or not, and we just keep doing it, and that's almost becomes the way of kind of assessing whether the intervention is working, is because it's actually happened every week for the last 8, 9 weeks or 20 years. It's kind of doesn't really help. Karen, was there anything else on recommendation 4 before I move on?
No, and I just agree with you. It's just making sure you know the right time to stop and think about what is the next step to take.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So recommendation 5, and this one, like a couple of the other recommendations, links really nicely and clearly to another guidance report that obviously we haven't got time to go into huge detail now, but flagging it up there. So work effectively with teaching assistants. So as you know, it's fairly obvious, I guess, that the effective deployment of teaching assistants or TAs is really critical, and that notion that TA should supplement, not replace the teaching from the classroom teacher. And so there's more details in that guidance report on this area. And so you can see there the different recommendations there, and you'll see some of them link back to these recommendations, and you'll see there. And I think for me, as always, as I mentioned earlier, it's just that, is the person doing the intervention, have they actually had the training? Otherwise, they're doing something and they're potentially not. I don't mean not doing the right thing, but they don't know. So it's making sure that that's part of your planning process as well. That if we want this intervention to happen, we think it's the right thing to do. We know how we're going to capture kind of and assess it. Where have we built in that training for TAs to make sure that they have that opportunity? And again on the website, we know that as we say, teaching assistant interventions do have an impact. There's sort of a kind of a growing amount of evidence that sort of seems to suggest that. But we do know, and this comes back to a point probably several years ago now, that it costs a lot of money, in the sense of staffing does cost a lot of money. So for me, it's always what with any staff that we have, how are we helping them to develop? And the more that we help them to develop, the better the interventions and any of the other work that they do with the children will be. So factoring that into cost as well, and making sure that if you've got using your pupil premium money and things like that, that you have that opportunity to use that to support that work. And this sort of feeds back really to what you mentioned earlier, Lucy, a bit, and that kind of that relationship and that making those connections and things. So I'll just let you kind of read that, just pause the video if that helps. And I think we have to just be mindful, obviously, of these things, and being careful of how children are feeling, and getting the feedback from children about how they are feeling if they're receiving that support. Obviously, we do want to support them, but the last thing we want to do is to make their life even worse by, having someone Velcro to them for the whole day and feeling like that.
We've used the simple red and green cards for that. So we've got quite a few children that have funded support through teaching assistants, but they were, from having limited support to getting quite a lot, they were finding it too much. So just a simple laminated card. Some have drawn their own pictures, but a green and a red. So green's I'm okay, red is could somebody please come and support? And that, I think, is giving them a bit more ownership. And it's also let the teaching assistant work with other children within the class that way as well.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds great strategy, isn't it, to help? And it
Really
comes back to
simple.
that building those relationships with the children, and understanding those cues when leave me to this. I'm fine now. You don't need to be, I'm okay to give this a go, and but kind of having them, as a teaching assistant, to come back to them, or as a teacher to come back to the child and sort of just do those check-ins as and when. And I always like this. I think this is always quite a useful table to consider. And I think sometimes, quite often, it's teaching assistants, not for any fault of their own, but can often be focused on completing a task for the child at any costs, rather than kind of really thinking about what's being learned, how am I supporting, those kind of things. So there's some avoids there, and encouraging that kind of taking risks with their learning, kind of the use of open-ended questions. I think that making sure that the pupils retaining their responsibility for their learning is important. So you don't get that kind of learn helplessness type thing kind of creeping in.
Yeah.
And obviously they're thinking about that kind of, as always with lots of these things, it's not one or the other, is it? There's a kind of spectrum to, so this document book's really helpful to kind of think through that process of where do we sit for this particular activity, what should I be doing, where do I need to, can I move away, kind of those kind of things. And as always, finally, with all of these things, just how important implementation of these bits are. So, you know, if we are using an intervention, are all the staff really clear on the use of it, how to assess it, how to use it, how to deliver it, kind of all of those kind of things, along with all the other work that we've been doing. And if you haven't seen the implementation guidance, that's also worth bearing in mind and checking out. So just to fit with Lucy, so just with the teaching assistants, that final recommendation, is there anything else that you wanted to add about that?
I think in my experience, they're all really passionate and here for the same reasons we are. You know, they want the absolute best for the children, but sometimes you find they're either not overly skilled or experienced, so that's a little bit of a professional development gap, or some of them have been in the role 20 plus years and are just doing the same thing repeatedly. A lovely example a few weeks ago is that I saw a TA pull two children out of an English lesson. They were writing their own version of the Three Little Pigs. She pulled them out, and before I realised what was happening, they were copying from a scribed piece on a whiteboard, 3 or 4 sentences, and I hadn't heard this vocabulary or information come from the children. And one of them called me over and into it. Oh, Miss Wallace, I'm a bit stuck. What word am I on? And I looked round, there were no whiteboard pens. So I said, don't you do this? Took some blue tack from the board and showed him how to put the blue tack above the word he was tracking. And I said, finish this sentence and we'll do some work together. And the TA had popped off to do something else and came back just as I'd sat down with the child. And we read the third sentence that was a description of the house that one of the pigs lived in. So I said to the child, right, now we're going to write our own. You tell me what the house looks like. And on a thin strip of paper, I scribed the sentence that the child told me. And they'd got an amazing word in there. It was elegant, which absolutely shocked me. Again, it was a year 3 pupil functioning around reception year 1, but they described part of the house as elegant. So I scribed the sentence and then I chopped each word into pieces. And at this point, the TA said, oh, this looks interesting. Can I join you? Yes, please do. Scooped her in with us. And I muddled the words up and said to the child, right, what was your sentence? Tell me again. And they could remember it. So I said, we're now going to put it into sequence. And they visibly recoiled because it was just a jumble of words. And I said, okay, how can we make this easier? And straight away, oh, I know, we could put short words here and the longer words here. So they got 2 columns. And I said, okay, we're looking for the. I said, that's the word that you use lots. Let's have a look. Really struggled to find the word the. House, we were looking for the house. But I explained to the TA as he was doing it that this was developing his phonics skills, his sight recognition, and there was so much more benefit to that than him having taken it from a whiteboard. The next word was looks like, and he got very muddled because we'd got lots of similar letters. So it needed a lot of support and guidance. But they were so proud when they got to stick that strip in that was their sentence. And I explained to the teaching assistant, she said, can I use that again? And I said, I would be using more of that than copying from a whiteboard. And it'd be really interesting actually to go back in now and see if that is being used more actively, because the TA was just doing what they were probably shown umpteen years ago that was a strategy at that point, but it's not really in line with thinking now in terms of developing phonics and phonetic awareness and linking that to writing. So they were getting reading practice in that lesson as well as writing. They were using all the different skills. And the child was absolutely beaming and so proud of that sentence because it was their language and everything that they'd pulled together. So definitely it's that working with the team to upskill them.
I think you say right, Lucy, is that feeling of success through independence, and that's what we're trying to achieve, isn't it? And they go home and just said, I've done this and I'm so proud of it.
Definitely, yeah.
Right, thank you. And I'll just take this before I pass to Karen for our final reflections. I'll just to say thank you, Lucy, for joining us today and sharing your expertise. That's great.
Thanks for having me.
And Karen, over to you.
So this is just a point to pause the video again and just think about through all of that. And we've talked about a lot. What would your new learning be? Is there a particular part of this guidance report you want to focus on? So you're doing just one thing really well, and then you can start to work through any key reflections. And what are your next steps having looked at this? Is it maybe you need to look at a shared language in school? Is it upskilling TAs and training? Is it thinking carefully about which interventions and how you're selecting your children? So just to think, there's a lot there to think through. Linked to our next evidence briefing, which is coming up on the 18th of June, that is about metacognition and self-regulation, which is perfect for recommendation 3. So if you haven't signed up for that, do that now, because that's really going to help support with that high quality teaching. We've been talking about all of those strategies there. So just to say thank you to both Alan and Lucy. It's really been great having Lucy here and having an expert to share this session with us. When you receive this, you'll also get the slides, but we've added lots of links to interesting blogs that have been written that could be supportive, and all sorts of things that we've mentioned in here. And at the very end, I won't go through it all now, but if you go on to the EEF site, you'll see all of these really useful tools here. And also there's some key things that we've mentioned. For example, like going to the whole school send, it's really useful to join up. Lots of really interesting resources, thinking about your offer as well in Lincolnshire, as well as sign up to Education Endowment Foundation. I'm sure Lucy's got many. I'll just sort of do things she would also recommend. So we will add all of that into this evidence briefing when we send that out with you. Lucy, is there anything else you would like to add?
It'd be nice to just end on a quote. Actually, we're part of we're working with the Whole Education Trust, and someone called Gary Orbin that works within that team. He's got a lot of experience. He gave us a lovely quote. Lots of our smaller schools are struggling, and we don't have a teaching assistant per class all day long like we used to have back in the day. And he said that every interaction is an intervention. So see the 6.5 hours that we have as opportunities to invest. And I just thought that was wonderful, because it does remind you that every little interaction that all of us have with the children, it is developing something for them. It's bringing their skills on in some way. And I just thought that was a really lovely reminder of what we're all here for, really.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll just leave that there and say thank you, and we look forward to joining you for our next evidence briefing.